Thank you for the invitation. And I believe there's nothing more important for us to talk about than regenerating our soils for the future of the planet. I began this understanding about regenerative agriculture while working in Africa, even though I had experience in conventional, taught at universities, ran nonprofits. But until I was able to combine no tillage with no outside inputs, allowing the biology to work, did I begin to fully understand what regenerative agriculture could produce for the planet. While there, I was able to show an increase in yields for smallholder farmers of 5 times. And this again brings food security, but also from the standpoint of climate change, creates resiliency and mitigation. Let me just say that some of the principles that are crucial to regenerating soils and addressing the issues of climate change, as well as food security, conservation agriculture has gotten a few things exactly correct. Our research at the university has been looking at what is going to support the biological life in the soil. And conservation agriculture told us that minimum soil disturbance is crucial. Secondarily, it said that permanent organic cover on the soil to protect the soil from the sun and the heat and the drying and the carbon loss is also critical. And third, conservation agriculture said, we need to rotate crops, creating species diversity. What perhaps is unique about regenerative agriculture using these same principles is they need a little adaptation, a little amending to show a more robust biology. But soil disturbance does destroy soils. And so that's a critical one that we'll leave as is. Let's minimize it or eliminate it to stop destroying the biology and the life of the soil and the erosion and the structure and increasing erosion through disturbance. So no-till or minimum till is critical. 2, the permanent soil cover that we talk about, we're talking about a living root in the soil for as many days of the year as is possible. And in certain climates with irrigation, that could be 365 days. And that is going to be the cover that feeds the life of the soil. The living roots are what feeds the biological life and the functionality of the soil. And third, when they say species diversification, what we're understanding is we need a very diverse, particularly cover crop, or with regard to other kinds of cropping systems, we need 3 to 4 classes of plants, 7 to 10 species in that diversity. It seems that in a temperate zone where you can use cover crops, that 7 to 10 species with grasses, legumes, and forbs will reset the biology of the soil to be able to carry a cash crop annually. This is critical, again, for the life of the soil. So regenerative agriculture does say no tillage or minimum tillage. That reduces or actually reverses the loss of carbon. This is an example, while we're doing work in Africa and Ghana, of what no tillage can do for food security. In the background is a small plot of cowpeas, and in the foreground is also a small plot of cowpeas planted on the same day. The only difference in treatment between these 2 plots is tillage. The front one was tilled, breaking up the soil structure, releasing carbon, and not having the ability, particularly I'll talk about, of a biology to produce a crop like we see in the plot in the background, where there's actually a full-blown crop of cowpeas that can be harvested for food. What happens when we till is we're increasing carbon loss, We're increasing actually the temperature of the soil, but we're losing water holding capacity and soil fertility, soil structure, water percolation. We're losing yield and profit, and we absolutely lose the nutrient cycling capacities that the soil can perform when it has good soil structure. What happens is that we are looking really for, and this slide didn't transfer as well, I apologize, but what we're looking for is a living soil. And this is what regenerative agriculture brings to the table, because it focuses on feeding this biology. The beauty is, and what this chart or picture should depict is, that the biological life of the soil is present basically everywhere in the air. The plants can capture it. All we really seem to need to be able to do is feed it. And how we feed it is back with those three principles: is stop breaking up the structure of the soil, and to be sure to get a live root so that the exudates, the plant carbon, sugars, and carbohydrates begin to collaborate with the biology, feeding it, thereby building fertile soils and growing plants, often even without fertilizers. What we see is this dramatic difference in roots. And the fertilized root on the left is what you would pull up out of a field if fertilizers are being used. There is just white roots. But when you see the microbial life really healthy, and you pull the roots up like the photo on the right, you see that the microbial life has created this rhizospheric presence where the plant is exudating, releasing sugars and carbohydrates, making the sticky substance, feeding the life of the soil. It's full of massive amounts of bacteria and protozoa and fungi that then are actually creating an exchange for the carbon from the plant, bringing water, bringing the nutrients that they can demineralize and find in the soil, and feeding the plant its nitrogen, its phosphorus, and all of the microminerals that are present that the plants sometimes have difficulty in accessing. We also know in this rhizosphere, which is a dramatic change for us in our understanding, and this was found by Dr. James White at Rutgers, is that the plant root actually consumes a number of the microbiology organisms, particularly bacteria. It takes them into the root and takes nutrients from them and releases either the parts of them, or actually the whole cell, which can regenerate and be recycled and brought back into the plant root. What this is telling us is not only are the microbiology bringing nutrients, sometimes they are themselves the nutrients for the plant. And that's why we focus on feeding the biology of the soil. When the collaboration exists, when the root hairs are stimulated to work with the life of the soil, then you have a functioning, healthy system. It's the way nature designed it. It's why regeneration happens so rapidly in our systems and in our research that I'll show you some data in a moment. This is just a picture or a microscopic filming of what the root hair exudates as far as amounts of sugars and carbohydrates to feed these organisms. And that's all carbon-based. That's how we can build soil organic matter much more rapidly in the soil, is by stimulating this root hair with the biology, by the exchange, by the relationship that is created. One of the organisms, or one species variety of organism I want to focus on today, is the fungal network, because the fungal network is what tillage and often chemicals will destroy first. Yet it is so critical to a regenerated soil. We're finding in our research, and it has been suggested by Dr. Elaine Ingham, that agricultural soils need to be fungal dominant, not bacterial dominant. If we go out and take a biological sample of our agricultural soils around the world, they are most all bacterial dominant. That's really caused by our farming practices, our historical farming practices of tillage and fertilizers. What we're finding is that When it moves to fungal dominance, it's when the system starts to function very, very productively. The net primary productivity begins to increase dramatically. And this depiction of roots with the root hairs actually connected to all these different mycorrhizal mycelial networks will tell us that often the mycorrhizae can increase the reach. In other words, the ability of that plant to access soil nutrients by 1,000-fold. So that's just given the plant a huge advantage now to find a micro mineral that it couldn't find necessarily with its own root system. But when it collaborates with the mycorrhizae, it increases its capacity dramatically to find micro water droplets in dry times, to find particular micro minerals, to transport nitrogen and phosphorus, even to demineralize bound up phosphorus and bring it to the plant. It is why my system in Africa works so well, because I was farming phosphorus poor soils, yet the plants never showed phosphorus deficiency, because there's always phosphorus present. It's just usually bound up. And this is what the biology, like the mycorrhizae, can demineralize and bring to the plant. One of the more amazing things, a paper has just come out that says mycorrhizae fungal groups will allocate 13 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent to these mycelium underground. That means over a third of what we are currently emitting into the atmosphere can be taken out of the atmosphere, or is being taken out of the atmosphere and sent down just to this mycorrhizae. We're seeing in regenerative agriculture, we likely can draw it all down, all, if we converted our agricultural systems tomorrow. Here's an example of mycorrhizae's advantages too when we find years of stress and weather. And this is an example in the lower left and the upper right are corn or maize seeds that were inoculated with mycorrhizae in poor soils in Florida, versus the lower right and upper left where no mycorrhizae were inoculated. And you see the corn or maize is functioning very well with the biology, with the fungal mycelial network, but it's performing very poorly without it. And this has to do a lot with water, the ability of these fungal networks to find the microdroplets and resist drought. So when we hear about conversations of genetically modifying seed, it's the wrong approach. What we need to do is build the health of the soil, and that will affect all crops, not just that one crop you bought special seed for. It doesn't cost you like genetically modified seed. This is an example too of not just the mycorrhizae, but what diversity brings in feeding the biology. And Dr. Christine Jones, who's a great resource for us all to learn from in soil health and regenerative agriculture, showing a picture in Canada during a drought year, where in the foreground, we see a triticale crop that has failed, not enough water. Whereas the photo on the right, that's a closer up image of that crop in the background, is a multi-species cover crop. But in there is triticale. You can see the grain standing, and it's a successful crop. It's the same amount of rain, but the diversity, feeding that microbiological life, feeding the fungal communities, means that there's an exchange of nutrients between plants and species, meaning that there is more water that's being able to be found by the microbiology. So this is a resilience way of farming, not just building health for the future, but actually surviving the stresses of climate today. At the University of Jena in Germany, they're showing that the more diverse we can create in our farming systems or in our cover crops, the more nutrients. Actually, it says that with one species, you'll produce just about nothing with regard to nitrogen. But when you get up to maybe 16 different species, that system can produce over 200 pounds of nitrogen for the crop that will follow it. There will be 22% more carbon that's then accrued in that soil, meaning creating healthier systems, meaning also helping in climate change. So diversity is crucial. Why haven't we been doing this, and why aren't we rapidly changing? Part of the reason is our science. Our science at our universities and our science at our research centers are often what we would call reductionist science. They're looking at one question and eliminating the other variables. They're looking at how much will a crop produce if we add this much fertilizer or this much of a certain nutrient, instead of looking at the whole system that nature has brought forward for us to learn from. The whole system. It's like the human body. If we look at one symptom and one issue and treat that, but we're not looking at an underlying cause, how the whole system is functioning, it's like we're working on a clock trying to fix a part instead of how we support the life and health of the whole dynamic system with its feedback loops, its signaling abilities, its capacity to heal and to restore. In working with a farmer in Southern California in a desert area who had never done cover crops before, had always tilled, he has absolutely started to change his farm. He farms 12,000 acres, and he's rapidly changing to no-till and to using cover crops. And the reason is, as our research has shown there, when we're looking at the difference here between the tillage conventional system and the no-till cover crop regenerative system, is the soil temperature is dramatically lower, even when you're going as far deep as over a foot. And what that means is the biology is going to stay alive better. The plants are going to respond better. I remember being out there one day where in Fahrenheit, I should have converted this to centigrade, I apologize. But in Fahrenheit, it was 120 degrees in the soil that had been tilled. And that actually was 100 degrees as far as the weather, the ambient temperature, but the soil was even hotter. And what's going to grow in 120 degrees? Whereas where the cover crop had been, it was 80 degrees, a dramatic difference in temperature and ability of plants to function in those systems. What we also see in the regenerative versus the conventional fallowed field as it's being turned over and tilled and getting ready for the next crop is we're seeing a dramatic increase in the living microbes. And that increase means, again, the capacity to transport water and feed the plant. It changes this soil to much more better aggregated soil, and we'll talk about that in a second, again with more carbon and food for the plant. When we look at the data from another study in Arizona we're doing with the total microbial biomass, on the left, we are seeing the total bacterial numbers that occurred in 2019 in the blue to the numbers in 2021 in the orange. And as we see a decline in the amount of bacteria on the left two columns, where there's a dramatic increase in the fungal communities on the right, and actually an total increase in overall life of the soil when you add those two columns together. So this is that shift that happens fast, going from bacterial dominant to fungal dominant soils when we stop the tillage and we start including the biodiverse multi-species cover crops. The other thing that changes is bulk density, meaning that we're going to get more air into the soil, more water percolation into the soil. With the air, as we know, is 70-some% nitrogen, we're going to get the ability of the free associating nitrogen-fixing bacteria to be available to help bring that free fertilizer to the plant. We get better water percolation, and we get better root penetration down into that soil. The other thing is there's less compaction. And so in essence, what you're going to see, of course, is a better response in the whole system. What this shows us is in the aggregate stability, when you do this cover crop and you get mycorrhizae fungi going, the soil then starts to be glued together in small particles, creating the air spaces and holding aggregation. So that reduces or eliminates erosion, as well as, again, creating the air spaces and water percolation capacities. And this, again, happens in just a year or two when you've changed to a regenerative system focused on the biological life. In this picture, I have my own soil samples. In the left is my field right outside my house. In the center jar of water. This was after 10 days. The soil was still aggregated. It had not melted and in other words, dissolved or in a rainstorm washed away. It's still sitting there as that clod of dirt. On the right are examples from Africa where I was farming extremely sandy soil. In the center again is the regenerative field. It's still aggregated. It didn't melt, it didn't wash. There's air spaces, and we're not going to lose that soil nor break up the mycorrhizae network that feeds those plants so well. What we see in water infiltration rates is a dramatic increase again. And I will just cite examples that Gabe Brown's farm in North Dakota, he was getting about 1/4 of an inch of water percolation per hour. After he'd gone regenerative for a few years, and now after a few decades, he has 14 inches of water percolation per hour. This last winter in California, where we had extreme rainfall, we had 4.5 inches in 15 hours. That's a tremendous amount of water in 15 hours. And I had no runoff in my field. It all went down. I captured the water for the future, or started to restore the aquifers. Whereas my neighbors, the water ran off. Actually, much of it ran into my own field because they had tilled. And so when we're thinking about the stresses of climate, we've got to capture all of the rain we can. We have to restore our aquifers and our streams and our springs, but we have to make that water available to the plant. Here's an example of what happens when you till. This was 0.15 of an inch, a tiny amount of rain that occurred that night before. By midday, the water was still standing and evaporating from that field because the soil structure had been destroyed by tillage. And so that rain event really was meaningless. It didn't go down. It wasn't used. It would take a day or two for that water to penetrate if you flood irrigated it, instead of the water going immediately down and not damaging the plant, but actually with air and with water feeding the plant properly. Let's talk about carbon, because carbon is the lifeblood and the life source of soil for the biology and therefore for the plant. We always want to increase our soil organic matter, therefore our soil organic carbon. In Arizona, we entered a research project there in 2019. This field had been no-tilled since 2014. And as we watched, there was an increase in soil carbon just through no tillage, because we weren't disturbing the soil, we weren't stimulating the bacteria that eat the organic matter and release the carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But when we applied the multi-species cover crop during the winter, look at the difference between 2019 and 2021. That equates to about 10 tons of carbon per hectare. That is a magnitude higher than the common literature about how much agriculture can capture. 10 times the amount, meaning we could fix climate change with regenerative agriculture, meaning we can build soil health and profit for the farmer because they need so much less as far as inputs are concerned to produce their crop. It builds the economic margin that most farmers need to be able to survive in today's economic challenges of farming. Just if we look at that in the form of dollars and cents, in the very first year in growing maize or corn in that field, we ended up with identical yields by putting the cover crops in the winter, between 250 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer and a full suite of fertilizers in the conventional system, versus only 15% of that amount. We had identical yields. In other words, a farmer could save so much more money when you're building these regenerative systems. With no fertilizer at all, it was more profitable than the full suite of recommended amounts of fertilizer, as we can see by this chart with 203 bushels of corn. When it comes to revenue, it became rather evident to the farmer that he could save a lot of money by moving to the regenerative system. In today's fertilizer cost, which now after the Ukrainian war that has occurred, we can see increased emphasis on amount of return to the farmer. because in fact, it would amount to more like $300 saved per acre in a regenerative system with a 15% fertilizer versus the full suite. We actually don't know what the sweet spot is here. Would it do the same at 5% of the normal fertilizer, as Christine Jones would suggest? Or does it do better at 20%? We don't know, because that would be a very expensive project. But we know we can reduce or even eliminate those costs for the farmers for their future economic gain. In the next year, when the pinto beans were grown in those same fields, we saw that the 0% fertilizer was by far the most profitable, followed by the 15%. And of course, the 100% was just an illogical move. Why spend that money when the regenerative system will produce the same yield, but increase the profit margin for the farmer? I just want to, as we're starting to wind down here, remind us of the importance of this biodiversity component. This is a diverse planting in India. We were just there in September. And this is actually a mango orchard. And there are cowpeas and pigeon peas and corn, maize, and squash and chili peppers, a whole host of plants planted between the trees. For that farmer, he eliminated his fertilizer needs. He actually has other crops to harvest now. Of course, in India, labor is cheap. It's actually too cheap. So they can go in and harvest these different crops independently. But importantly for the mango conversation is, it says he took those mangoes to market. The consumer told them they were the best tasting mangoes they had eaten since they were a child. In other words, get the biology right and the nutrients are brought to the crop, not just to the plant, but actually to the crop. They were sweeter, they were tastier. Of course, it's going to have more microminerals in it. And the other thing they mentioned is the shelf life of those mangoes were 4 times that of conventionally grown mangoes, where we traditionally see bare ground between trees and fertilizer applied to those trees. What we know in regenerating is there are opportunities everywhere on this planet to regenerate soils. This is a picture of 2 ranches side by side in the Sonora Desert in Mexico, just across the border in Texas, from Texas. When you graze differently in a holistically managed operation, when you intensely graze animals and get them off rapidly, you stimulate the biology of the soil. You spread seeds, and what little rain comes, those seeds will grow. If you constantly graze and abuse that soil, you end up with a desert. If you don't, you end up with a well-managed system where photosynthesis is taking place 365 days a year, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and building the life of the system. We're doing a flux tower study down in Blythe, California, on that desert farm. And what we're doing is measuring the moment by moment, let me see if I can get this to go, amount of carbon dioxide that is being taken out of the atmosphere by the photosynthesis of the crop and held in the soil, and also measuring the amount of carbon dioxide that is being respired out of the soil and returned to the atmosphere. What this is giving us is it's giving us data points to show what regenerative agriculture can do alongside conventional farming. And in essence, I'll show you a quick graph. It's too soon to really summarize this data for the season. But when we look at, let me go to the next slide here. When we look at these top 2 charts, this top one is the daily carbon uptake on the regenerative field that is sitting side by side to the conventionally farmed field, which is the next chart of green. So everything above the baseline is carbon being held in the soil, captured and held in the soil. That below the baseline is being released on those days. So we see a lot more carbon, in other words, a healthier soil being created in the regenerative system. And over the years, this is going to give us moment by moment data points on what regenerative can do for the health and life of the soil and our planet. We actually know regenerative agriculture could take us back to our pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As Christine Jones says, if we increased the amount of photosynthesis on the planet by 5%, it would equal all of the emissions we are releasing to the atmosphere. 5% is very easy to do if we move to regenerative farming. If we plant cover crops in the winter instead of bare soil, if we increase the species diversity and increase that density of photosynthesis occurring, the different root exudates feeding different organisms below the soil line, and the amount of carbon that we saw in the mycorrhizal mycelium network that will be held down in the soil, sometimes for 100 or 1,000 years. With that, I'd like to just remind us, we need to disturb the soil not at all if possible. We need living roots in that soil for as many days of the year as possible. And we need, at least for half the year, to have a very diverse cover crop to feed the different organisms that will help us have the most functional soils for our agricultural crops to feed the planet. With that, I'm very, very open to questions or comments and would like to thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry, I don't speak Turkish, so we could have made it easier. With that, I would like to turn it back to you. Elif, please.